Welcome to the Voicehacks Podcast. I'm your host, Mary Z. On the Voicehacks Podcast, I'll be talking to some of rock and metal's best singers, coaches, and experts about what goes into the mysterious and amazing sounds we make with our voices. If you like this podcast, please help spread the word by sharing it with your friends. Post our episodes on your Facebook and Instagram, and tag me and my guests. I'm at Metal Mary Z on Instagram. Don't forget to leave the show a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. And of course, follow me on YouTube at Voicehacks by Mary Z. Let's get into it. Hey everyone, thank you so much for listening yet again to the Voicehacks Podcast. It's me, Mary Z, back once again, and it's my absolute pleasure today to be interviewing a man who you would normally see behind the mask. We have Mike Bishop of GWAR with us, and in his alter ego, you might know him doing the vocals and fronting the band these days as Blothar. But at the same time, you might also know him as Dr. Michael Bishop, who you might have seen in TED Talks and other places behind the mask. And that's kind of why I wanted to have you on today, was actually the man behind the mask and who Dr. Michael Bishop is. And your doctorate, as I understand it, is in musicology. Is that correct?
Well, just music, but it was a musical, not a performance focus. So it was musicology is what I was doing.
What is musicology, to be specific?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, in some ways, it's like they just stuck the word ology on it so that they can count it as a science when it's about as sciencey as political science, right? It's
right.
I mean, it's math, I guess. But musicology, the way that I do it anyway, is ethnomusicology, right? So it's sort of like a cross between anthropology and music and sociology in a way, or anthropology. I mean, but it's I mean, there are other branches of musicology, including studying theory and writing about that, studying sort of the cultural impact of music. I taught courses like music and literature, for example, and a bunch of stuff about writing about music.
Yes, I've read that you have been and are occasionally a professor. Is that something you're currently doing now, teaching music in universities?
No, not right now. I can't. The band kind of put an end to that just because we're so busy that I can't sign a contract.
I understand. As soon as I said that, I actually ate those words because I just saw you in Las Vegas on the tour with Crowbot. So I was like, I know the answer to that.
Yeah.
But I have a bachelor's in music, and I talked to someone who's teaching at my university where I graduated. I graduated a long time ago, so the times have changed and people don't seem to really want to go to school. One of the requirements, as you know, in traditional, like accredited universities is that it has to be classical. What we do, rock and metal, is somewhat verboten, and especially probably when you were getting your bachelor's, and certainly when I was, it was even more forbidden than it is now. And he was talking about how it's becoming a barrier to entry, and how people are kind of turned off of getting a music degree, but at least for singers, they don't want to sing classical music. Do you see that as when you were teaching? Did you kind of notice that as a trend, that people kind of don't want to do that anymore? Are they still more interested in the traditional things?
Well, I mean, at the University of Virginia, which is where I was teaching, there were a lot of kids that were surprisingly traditional.
Wow.
Yeah, but I mean, like the wild musicology is a very slow moving field. And I mean, there's a way that people talk about music. Well, music is German, right? It's it's classical music, right? And that's the whole definition of music. But that's certainly changed a lot. And you have people that are coming into school and majoring in jazz vocals and things like that. Even choral singing. which I guess actually that might be considered classical, but yeah. So I mean, I do think that that the sort of way that we've allowed music in the academy to become a museum piece is a mistake, right? Like it shouldn't be a museum. It should be something active and modern, or at least have that option, right? But weirdly, at that school, like I said, there were, you know, especially as far as performance, there wasn't a lot of modern, interest in modern stuff, which was surprising to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, but it's kind of strange to me though, as a musician who does metal, that in classical school you really weren't allowed to look at anything except jazz. But I would say that this kind of ends at the same point, past like 1945, maybe 1950, maybe. They let me get up to the like Schoenberg, and then that's it. That was about it. So, like the metal, the rock, and I think that's kind of strange. I mean, I guess sometimes there's not that much to study because you're like, oh, it's all minor pentatonic. But at the same time, I feel like it would be cool if it didn't start at that point and we got to hear more about, what people are doing in modern music. So
yeah, I mean, we know that's not true though, right? Like, I mean, there's a lot of interesting sort of modal work and just work on harmony that goes into rock music. And I think the angle that I teach, which is sort of like a more cultural and historical focus on music, that area of music, we have come into the modern. I taught a course on history of rock, history of country music.
wow.
Yeah, things like that.
So there you are, certainly branching into the future.
Yeah, but it's not the performance, right? Like the performance studies seemed like there's very little. Like jazz is, like you said, is about as modern as it gets. And I guess like when I was talking about choral music, sometimes they do like modern composing, right? Like modern classical music, which
Yes.
so there is that side of it.
Yeah. Do you feel that you ever look at the stuff you do with GWAR through this lens, or is it a different lens that you're viewing the rock and metal, the metal that you write through, or do you think it all ties together, the music theory and everything?
Yeah, it all ties together. I mean, I just use the practical amount of music theory. Like I'm not,
Yes.
because there's a big difference in theory for performance and theory for analysis. It's, but
That's a really good point.
yeah. So that's what I mean, for me, it's more like I do look at GWAR historically, though. I mean, I think of what we're doing in context. And I'm sitting here trying to think. I mean, on the last record, there's definitely, sometimes like if you're reaching for melodies, I like, Schubert, great source of melody. It's like, what do you want? Like, well, let's see. Everything's in E flat minor. Here we got a sonata.
Mm-hmm.
And he's doing something pretty good. I just love that guy's art song is so great. So there's a lot of sort of, I think maybe what I'm saying is that the tools that I use and the range of influences has been influenced by or shaped by my education. But I don't really look at it like sort of through a lens of classical music. I just sort of have some different stuff to reach for.
That's really cool. I sang a lot of the Schubert art songs in college because as you can tell, I have a very low voice, and we either get castrati arias or German stuff.
Right.
So,
yeah.
But you get a lot of melody, and that's where music starts to get really dark, right? Music takes a dark turn. in the
Yeah,
1800s.
definitely. And Schubert in particular, I mean, yeah, Der Doppelganger. So
Hmm.
like with what is it, Dietrich Fischer?
Dieskau,
Uh,
Dietrich Fischer
yeah,
Dieskau. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Such
I would listen to a lot of his recordings to learn the songs because, I just find sight singing to be the most impractical thing in the world. Yeah, even when I was in school for it, your ears learn so much faster. I could read music just fine, but I'm not going to plunk out my melodies on the piano. So I listen to a lot of
yeah,
Dietrich Fischer Dieskau's recordings. And yeah, I love it. And one of the ones that's so metal that Schubert does is Der Tod und das Mädchen, Death
yeah,
and the Woman.
yeah. So good.
It doesn't
Yeah.
really get any more metal than that, you know.
No,
And it's
no.
really dark sound too. The music becomes very melodically dark, which is sort of something we hadn't really seen too much of before.
Yeah, right.
Um, Dark times. So the
Mhm.
TED Talk you mentioned, I want to circle back around to what you said about GWAR, where you said, historically, and I think this is huge because GWAR took things to a level historically for rock and metal that people really jumped off of later, but you were the first, and then still are the only in many ways with what you do with the stage show. I can't point to a lot of other bands in which the stage needs to be covered in plastic to facilitate the performance. And I think your TED Talk really touched on the cultural identity of the band.
I mean, what I was trying to do was just demonstrate, or what I was asked to do, and which I really didn't have the time to do, was uh, just to sort of explain GWAR in context, right? With the idea that GWAR, this band that's supposed to be from outer space, but it's really shaped by its locality, right? Just like all music winds up being shaped by where it is, and where it's from, and where the people who
Mm-hmm.
do it are from, and um, and in some ways, GWAR really that uh, uh, reflects that environment of Richmond, Virginia. A small southern town, or not a small southern town, but a it's just really sort of a new South town, right? It's maybe a smallish, medium sized, um, during the context of the mid 80s, right? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and looking at that environment and just the sort of the state of things, the economy, politics, what Richmond is like and what it was like. These things really allowed the band uh, to form. And people don't often think about those things, right? They don't think about things as being uh, uh, very situated historically, and culturally.
So, what are the things from Richmond? Because, obviously listening to this not being from Richmond, I'm like, this is so interesting. How is this reflected in this? Because, and I know what you're saying, though, because if you look at metal as a whole, where this sounds like Scandinavian metal. This sounds like,
Mm.
even when we look at some newer bands that come from Israel or Mirath from Tunisia, you
Oh
can
yeah,
actually hear those influences in their music. So I
right.
get what you're saying, but I'm really curious, what are the aspects of culture in Richmond that helped shape GWAR?
Well, it's a little bit different than what you're describing. I mean, that's sort of, I think, maybe identity in a
Mm.
sense coming into that music, right? I'm thinking of and identity certainly comes into play in GWAR, but I really was thinking more of, you know the city, right? Richmond during that time period was pretty much emptied out, like a lot of New South cities, right? Like it had been, uh, people had fled, white people had fled to the suburbs that could, and people who didn't have the ability to do that were stuck in the city. So you had a lot, a very prominent Black population in the town, and there was this flight had really created some spaces in the city, which were available, very inexpensive for people who are just poor, starving artists to go and get into these spaces. And, and that's literally how, GWAR was formed in an abandoned dairy.
Wow.
That they had turned into rehearsal spaces while they were renovating it, right? It was this sort of crooked renovation project that took like 30 years. Eventually they made it into condominiums, but back then they hadn't. And so we were just kind of living there, and working there. And there were a lot of artists doing that. So in that way, just as it's a very sort of practical relationship between the economy and the history of the city that allowed GWAR to form. Just the fact that Virginia Commonwealth University is there and had drawn this particular group of people to the city is something that, and in GWAR's case, it was really interesting because it's like everybody was in the sculpture department.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you would think the music department, but but actually, no. Actually, you know what? Now that you say that, and looking at the sculptural design of a lot of what you wear on stage.
Oh yeah.
Now it makes sense.
Right. Well, but that's always the case, though. Like if you look, I don't know. It's very unsurprising to me that, like, all the good bands are going to come out of the art school, not the rock, and not because they have.
And not the music school.
Right,
no, I agree with that.
Yeah, because they're not doing, because like you said, they can't get past 1945. It's like, bebop is about as modern as they're going to get.
Oh yeah, that was it. That was the limit. Yep.
Yeah.
And I don't particularly care for bebop, and I always felt like the bebop people were weird. I was like, those are like the jazz kids over there, and I don't understand them. But this is cool. So this is really interesting because one of the things that I think musicians tend to do is we tend to be like, there's no opportunities in that shithole town or that little place where, that's not Los Angeles, that's not this, that's not Berlin or whatever. And you're saying because people left, you actually were provided some opportunities. And that's a cool way to look at it.
Right. And you also can't sort of divorce, there are some really negative connotations to that, right? We were in those spaces because they had been vacated by people who previously lived there, right? Or because just the kind of economic situation in downtown Richmond had gotten pretty dire. There was a lot of crime. There was a lot of like I said, just nobody that didn't have to go there didn't want to be there, right? So we moved into these spaces that people didn't want. But there is even, like a racial element to that as well. People had, it was based in a sort of race-based flight out of the city that had allowed us to move into those spaces. And, we can't sort of ignore that aspect of it. It's so it's very in America, like everything, very tied to race, right? Very tied to economy.
Yeah. And people don't understand the 80s when he began. It's like when you look back, this is only 20 years after the civil rights movement. And in the South, a lot of things are still lingering at this time. It just doesn't magically have a shut off button.
And Richmond's the capital of the Confederacy. And that recently, like during the pandemic, came to light with a lot of the sort of political stuff that was going on there with the statues and things like that. But
certainly, yeah.
But at the time, it was really absolutely unthinkable that they would remove those statues in the mid '80s. That was the another way that GWAR kind of reflected that town is that we looked at our environment and we chose to be from outer space, right? Like a lot of people that come from Richmond and bands that come from Richmond, I've noticed that they've started to kind of incorporate that into their identity, right? Like,
Yeah.
we're a Southern band and we come from here and we play Southern rock, Alabama Thunder Pussies. And I mean, even Avail, which was a sort of punk band out of Richmond.
Mm-hmm.
They have an album that's titled, I don't know, something about the James River, which is the river that flows through it. And we never would have associated ourselves with the city, partly because of its reputation, right? And also because, I mean, I think somewhat also because of the music we were involved in, right? There was a sense of punk rock transcending the local, even at that time, right? Like there were scenes all over the country and all over the world that you could be, so you were part of this international community. And being from Richmond felt more like a hindrance than anything else. But in retrospect, it's part of what made us distinct and what shaped, just like the people that we would bring on stage. I mean, they were the people that we were seeing in our lives, right? These archetypes, the redneck from hell.
Nice. Yes.
Things like that, a lot of televangelists and the Reverend Oral Swallow.
I love it. Do you feel in a way this was a good outlet for you guys to sort of rebel against some of that stuff? I mean, that's some fairly conservative stuff in the South there.
Oh yeah. I mean, for sure. It was GWAR was taking on all the things that we thought were just that we could lampoon. I mean, anything, it's and something people would recognize and laugh about, so they recognize the redneck that comes out on stage.
They know him in real life.
They know him, yeah. And they know Oral Swallow, and they
know him too.
Yeah, so in a way, it's like these archetypes get just they become they're really recognizable and really useful for us, right? But they definitely came from our environment. The artsy guy that was sort of lampooning the school, right? That and actually what GWAR had emerged from, right? And really the whole band, I mean, was sort of the project of it was to destroy art because people were so alienated by the experience of art school in the middle 80s, right?
Yes.
It wasn't, that was a time when you were, if you drew comics, right, you were an illustrator, you weren't an artist, right? And that's really changed. I mean, the sort of line between high and low has really blurred in some ways that proves useful for GWAR. But that when we started, I think, we were involved in the project that now we see the fruits of that, right? Like that those barriers have been torn down a lot, but they were there when we started.
I think it's so cool to listen to how the band history came together, because I think people just go, oh, GWAR, that's the band. I've got to, they're going to spray stuff on you. And there's so much more to it historically. And quite frankly, looking back, the way I view it is if you guys hadn't come out with the masks and the costumes, I mean, there was the glam, but that's a little different. That's different. Mm-hmm. That was existing, but I felt like you guys were characters. You have different names. You cover your faces. I mean, this was a new thing entirely. Now, since then, there are other bands that took inspiration from that, but I can't think of a single one that did it in that way. Even Alice Cooper, he dons his character, but he wasn't covering his face, the separation. You take people to another thing. You're from outer space. It's really cool. Yeah.
And then the project of, really tearing down the distance between the audience and the performer, like allowing that, just trying to collapse that so that people become part of the show.
Oh.
And I think that's very much a way that GWAR build. I'm not going to say innovated. I mean, we built on ideas that other people had, and that's what all art is. But we were able to focus it. And yeah, I mean, it does suck sometimes that people look at it and reduce it. But those people aren't paying attention.
No, yeah. There's so much going on, especially if you're an entertainer. You really can see all the layers of what's going on. And I have kind of a weird question that kind of is diverting a little bit. But when when you're on stage and you have a mask on and things, how are you hearing yourself to know where you are vocally? Are you wearing in-ears? Do you use the floor? I mean, what are you doing up there?
Yeah, I mean, for a long time we couldn't use in-ears because of the masks. But then we and then the it was GWAR's hard. It's a hard band to be in.
Yes. Yeah.
It's a hard band to perform in. I mean, when I have gone out with other bands, it's like, oh my God, this is what you do. Like, this is a vacation. I mean, you're just riding around, hanging out with your friends. I mean, GWAR, like it's work every night on stage in a way that other bands aren't, I think. Everybody is into the performing, and everybody has their own challenges and frustrations, I know. But for GWAR, yeah, I mean, it took a while for us to develop even the ability to get, the technology to get the so that the wirelesses weren't getting destroyed and we could wear the in-ears. We put them in a little condom so that the transmitter doesn't get wrecked, and they still get wrecked. Just dealing with microphone, like wireless microphones, constantly getting knocked over by somebody's antlers or something like that.
Covered in liquid.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's like trying to play your songs, trying to play heavy metal in the middle of a football game. And you're on the field, right? Like
a football game in the mud and rain, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So you got to try not to get wet. You got to try. So it's hard. And as far as singing, I mean, I the biggest thing sort of challenge singing wise is that you moving, right? Like it's not so much the voice as it is I have to move. And it's very easy to move when you're not wearing anything and when people can see your movements. But there's a lot of I have to move a lot for Blothar to move at all, right?
Sure. I mean, that costume looks kind of heavy,
It's very heavy. It weighs 74 pounds.
Whoa, that's way more than I thought that you were going to say.
Yeah. So, and I've got the big heavy shoes on, and yeah, so it's hard, and then you read people like, oh, Blothar just stands there. It's like, come on up here.
Well, I've carried around like a 50-pound backpack for like some heavy duty hiking stuff, and that was way too much. I cannot even imagine wearing a 74-pound costume.
Yeah, it's rough.
And people already, you can tell. So, for example, when I watch a lot of, the more technical the singer is, the less running around they're going to do. Unless you're Bruce Dickinson, which he's the exception to everything. But aside from him, most of the people that are getting more technical, when I watch more power metal or prog metal singers, they're not moving as much. They're more like standing in place and like executing to the best as they can,
Right.
But because it's tough. It's like you are the instrument, and now you're doing that on top of a show that's very theatrical, so they're expecting a lot of movement in basically carrying around another person on your back, essentially the weight like a child, a 10-year-old or something. It's really heavy. I mean, this is really tough to do all of those things. Do you have, that being said, do you have a method on the road that you do to kind of facilitate being able to do that every night? A routine?
I mean, yeah, you get into one. I used to do a lot of vocal, just this sort of. There's a guy from Richmond who was a very good vocalist. His father taught it at Virginia Commonwealth University, and he taught me this thing called the whole voice method.
Wow.
Which was sort of like, it's very meditation oriented, right? And so I do some of that. And I used to do a lot more of it. These days, I just sort of do the very end of it just to get my voice warm and then go out there. But yeah, I mean, there's not too much preparation. You just sort of have to spend some time and make sure that you get in that character, and then go out and do it.
So it's
So
more getting into character for you than like technical singing warm ups or anything like that.
yeah, I would say. I mean, that's the hard thing about GWAR, right? Like, I mean, being a singer is a lot, to me anyway. It's a lot less difficult than being this character, right?
Mm,
That's sort of the hard part for me. And the guy that I replaced, it was very easy for him, right? That was his strength, was being that.
sure. I loved how you paid tribute to him at the show when I saw you. With you guys have some really great videos, and I think that's really cool how you've been able to take his character, keep it honored, honor him, carry that into the future, and basically tie the two eras of the band together.
Yeah, I mean, Dave, he was a great singer, and learning all of his parts was a great sort of meditation on him, right? Like, and it was something that I uh, was uniquely positioned to do, I think. Not only because of having known him and been there and wrote a lot of the material as a bass player, um,
Mm-hmm.
but like also because of my education and because of my ability to kind of listen into things and figure out what kind of approaches I could use that might uh, be similar to what he's doing, but sort of its own thing. Um, and yeah, I mean, it's been hard because he was such a great performer, and so active and live and entertaining, to watch, and just had this sort of rapport with the audience. Like I said, I mean, that's the tough stuff, like uh,
Mm.
sort of finding a voice that works for GWAR songs. Brocky, he had some interesting techniques too. Very, he did everything the same, whether it was painting, because he was a fine art painter,
Mm.
whether it was drawing comic books or playing bass guitar, which he also did, or singing. He all sort of always approached it with this kind of like very self-taught, very almost, I want to say, instrumental, like just, I'm using this so I can get this out of my system, right? Or so I'm just using it to express this thing. I
Mm-hmm.
don't care about learning all of this crap that's tied with it, right? I just want to express this thing. Um, and in doing that, in that project, he developed some really interesting sort of voices that he could go into, and different kind of resonances. He also had a different voice type than mine, which has been challenging, right? He's got that the baritone, and that's
Sure.
gold for rock music, man. I mean, if I could have a baritone, I would have it, but I don't. Um, so he had that nice chest resonance and a big giant head. That,
But the grass is always greener. I mean, I teach singing full time, and I have a low voice, and I'm telling you that the higher voiced folks people are all super envious of them as well, you know. And you know, and I get, like, for some of the characters and stuff, you might enjoy the deeper tones and things, but I think there's a lot of advantages to have a higher voice too that people
yeah,
would give their right arm for.
right. I'm right in the middle. I've got neither, so I'm.
Mm. It sounds kind of higher though, like to me,
It's
because I
higher.
mean I just saw you, and also talking to you, listening to your speaking voice. But this is advantageous, and I don't know if you find this, but the whole trick is relative perception, when it comes to voice or musical instruments as far as pitch goes, because most people don't have perfect pitch and they can't actually hear if it's a C or a D or actually where it is on the piano. So then that's when you make it sound, if you add more texture, it sounds darker, even though maybe the pitch isn't that low. The audience can't always perceive that, I think if you do things right, or if you just change the key a little bit, you make it low for you, but so it still sounds low, but they can't perceive that it's not the same low as the other low, if that makes sense. I do this with highs.
Makes total sense. I mean, I'm excited because I can actually talk to you about something that I've been thinking about periodically, that I noticed and actually thought about writing about from a musicological standpoint if I had the time, which is the way that like a damaged voice adapts, right? Like it's almost like there are different channels that you're using when you sing, and you can there's the way that you do it that's ideal. This is the ideal way. But when that's compromised in some way, and it does become compromised, I mean, if you can't do 100 shows and not have it be compromised, you find some, or you get sick. I mean, being sick is a great example, right? Then the upper range goes away, but somehow you're able to deliver it in a way that you just find something else in the voice that takes its place. That's very interesting to me.
Yes. And I think that's actually the secret to a lot of famous vocalists. It's not that Freddie Mercury actually was perfect every freaking night. He did a lot of things when you actually look at what people are doing. Like you dive in and look at it like an instrument, like you're talking about, which you're going to do because you're a front person and vocalist, and you're going to have to think about things that way. You see that they're not actually literally being perfect every night. There is something that they have to do to adapt it, and we're sort of like magicians. The audience isn't necessarily aware that we're doing that. So,
right.
Yeah.
It's an interesting thing. I mean, it's the Inears. Sometimes I can't tell if they help or not. I mean, that isolation issue really is a real thing. And when a lot of times, because I would sweat a lot, and they
come out.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so I'm just sitting there without it, and I'm like, wow, I can actually hear the room, and I can hear, that's another interesting aspect of vocal performance that nobody's written about, which is that just the using space, right? That you're in, which singers do really well, right? Like you can hear them doing it, and you can hear the pleasure they take in it, even, right? Like I can hear these resonances coming back at me in this club. I hear the way my voice sounds out there, and so you change what you do in some ways to adapt to it. It's really interesting.
I absolutely love that, because that's the hard part is when I'm talking to people, we're always talking about, okay, when we have the in-ears, it's nice for some things, but then other things, like, for example, sometimes, people are putting those crowd mics out there to actually let you hear that in your in-ears because you can't hear it otherwise. But I do like that. I like when I can actually hear a little bit of it coming out of the front of house, like coming back, but and again, some people will actually have their guy mic it to do that. But sometimes, the one thing that I think is hard is sometimes the in-ears just aren't loud enough. I mean, your crowds are loud. When your sound checking in that room is empty, that's one thing. You put in that loud GWAR crowd in there, and it's a whole nother thing.
Yeah, that's definitely true. It was weird in Europe, our audiences were actually a little smaller, and we were playing smaller places. And I was really enjoying, even though the crowd was really close, like I was just enjoying the way it sounded in those spaces. Was kind of fun.
Do you think like the Europeans, do they get into it as much as the Americans do, or are they more observant?
Oh, God. I mean, the first time, I mean, I should qualify and say that, GWAR did really well in Europe when I was in the band the first time. We came, after Dave died, we stopped going over there. And so we kind of lost a lot of ground that we're having to make up now. So that's why, we've been playing festivals and then playing smaller places. But yeah, I mean, the very first time, I'll never forget it when we played in a squat in Bielefeld, Germany. Had a gravel floor, right? Like everybody's in there standing on ground. Yeah. And we're playing up on the stage. And after we play, like, the people come up to us and they asked us why, right? That was their question. Like, why do you do these things? Like, what, and nobody had really ever asked that, right? They were just kind of shocked by it. So that was interesting, like trying to explain to somebody why. I remember Brocky just got really angry and said, "Why not?" Which is probably a much better answer than what I gave them, which was, "I don't know. Let me look at my belly button and think about it. Why? I don't know." But yeah, I mean, sure. The Germans in particular, and the way crowds react is so different. Like in France, in Paris we played. I remember that, and the hall just emptied as soon as we started spraying people with stuff. Like they just left, and stood in the back, and watched. They were interested in seeing it, but not interested in getting wet. And of course, like after a while, that goes away. People know what to expect from the band. But it's interesting when you play like right now in the East, there's some places that we haven't been. And that I can't wait to go to eventually, because GWAR in new territories that's the funnest part of it.
Oh yeah, I mean, the only thing I've ever seen that sort of made the audience part of the show in that way was Rocky Horror. Like when you go to one of those Rocky Horror ones where they do the immersive stuff. Not every Rocky Horror performance is like that, but it's still not even close to what you guys do. So people come in and it's just like, oh my God, it's like beyond anything like Gallagher or anything that's like ever sprayed stuff at people before. And it's combined with some great music. I wanted to ask you, what are the international touring plans looking for? You got anything on the docket for this year?
Well, yeah, we're doing. I mean, we have a tour that's a bigger tour where we're actually opening for somebody, and that's been a challenge with this band. Is like, a lot of the kind of commercial avenues that other people take haven't been available to us, right? Like, partly because the band is obscene in some ways, but also because the show that we do, it's taken a while to convince people, look, we can get on and off the stage, and the stage isn't going to be any different when you get up there, and but it's still like, do people want their crowd to be covered in stuff, um, so but we actually managed to score an opening gig, so we're going to do a lot of so we're going to do a lot of touring for that, and I can't really say what that is yet, but we will be doing that, and then we're doing and that's a couple, like 2.5 months. It's a pretty long one, and we're going to be going to Europe to do some festivals, and we're also playing in South America a little bit, in Mexico.
Wow.
Yeah, we're trying to get more stuff down there, and we'd love to go to Japan and Australia, but we haven't been able to make that happen yet for this coming year. But we're trying.
Have you performed in Japan before?
We did, one time, and we did 2 shows, and that was yeah, it was. I mean, we always wanted to go there, but Japan doesn't really. I mean, we've got a lot of work to do there, right? To let people know
Yeah.
what we're doing, and get into it.
I just feel like that kind of audience would actually kind of get what you're doing because they like a lot of fantasy and costumes and really appreciate like a show like that. So
They do, but they're also extremely orderly, right? Like
Right. So the mess is also disrupting that. Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, when they had the promoters were very concerned about the out of controlness of GWAR, right? Like okay, it's we're gonna, and they put tape down and made a kind of spew zone, right? Like here's where people go to get spewed on, and interestingly enough, like the crowd just sort of was around it, like they weren't going in there, I mean, in America, that wouldn't have happened, right? Like it's like nobody's going to honor this tape that's on the floor. But people did, they didn't cross into these areas. Unless they wanted to get wet, and so gradually they would come up and and experience it. But it's really, really interesting. So there's sort of competing things. Plus the band just hasn't had a lot of presence over there since we first started, and now, I mean, we've managed to turn over sort of a much younger crowd in the States now. And hopefully we can do that in other parts of the world.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting to me about the doing music in the 21st century now is like everything old is new again. And because we sort of passed like a cultural and technological like music recording threshold sometime in the late 80s, I would say. When kids listen to this stuff, because their generation, the younger kids, is sort of devoid of good rock music. Everyone's like, well, why do they keep listening to all this old stuff from the 80s and 90s? And I'm like, because they have nothing. They have no artists of their time. So they're discovering GWAR. They're discovering everything from decades ago. And it's like the best thing ever to them.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I noticed that when I was teaching, like in the history of rock, it's like, again and again, you would ask kids what their, what's your music, right? And a lot of times it would be classic rock. It's what they heard, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, just because that's what's available to them if they listen to rock radio, like they're not listening, at least in certain areas of the country, right, where they don't have like active rock radio or something like that.
Even then, it's such a small market share of commercial radio and people. And again, like those are not artists of their generation at all. This is like artists from your parents' generation. I mean, that used to be uncool, and now it's cool.
Yeah, it's really, that was really frustrating to me because I was like, gosh, I mean, I wanted to learn from them, and I did. I mean, I did. Like, there definitely was stuff that they were into, but surprisingly, sorry about that. Surprisingly, it's not usually. Well, maybe not surprisingly, it's not generally rock music that they were listening to. That was, it was more like hip hop and EDM and stuff like that.
Do you ever check out any of the newer metal bands, which we do have? Like Spirit Box, Ginger, that kind of stuff, or?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of good singing, that's for sure. In some ways, the singing like follows this pattern, though, that has emerged even like with the instrumentalism in those bands, which is this kind of emphasis on virtuosity.
Yes, yeah.
That is interesting, but not exciting to me. Like I prefer. It's only interesting to me, like in as much as it manages to harness genuine emotion, right? Like, then I like what I'm hearing, right? But otherwise, like, I mean, coming from a punk rock background, I think, what I'm looking for is this rawness, and just an emphasis on feeling, that sometimes seems like some of it gets lost with and then there's the sameness. I don't like the sameness. I like stuff to sound unique. But I mean, I'd like Ginger. I really like. I love how she sings, and um, there's lots of stuff. I love even like somebody like Randy from Lamb of God. Like I mean, he's a good singer. He's got it's really weird that there's like, but there are techniques involved, and like I don't think anybody else is going to grab that mic and do that. They're not going to do what he does like the way that he does
Yeah.
it. So I'm have a kind of a wide range of interests and approaches to vocals. I'm really fascinated by that, by like how people, one thing I've noticed that's weird is like when you see these sort of death or the really growly guy that I call him like the mountain gorilla vocal.
I love it.
Yeah. And have you heard him hit those overtones like
Yes.
the Tuvan shit? Like, and
Yes.
I don't know if they hear it. And I'm like, man, there is a ring that is going on in this. Lorna Shore, that kid has got some shocking technique. But it's really, really interesting, man. And that's gutsy music to me. I really like it.
And what an example of what the limits of what you can do with human sounds are, I guess, the soundscape that a human being can create.
Yeah, and it's weird. It's almost like I think of it like football, right? It's like, well, the guys just keep getting bigger and stronger.
Yeah.
And like even like women's basketball, like just track and field, like the athletes just keep getting better, and what they can do keeps getting more extreme. And I think that in music it's kind of the same. I mean, because the drummer is just as amazing as that singer.
Yeah. I mean, and you can see that in all these instruments over time, over the decades. Again, pretty much like once we cross sort of a certain threshold in the 80s, and then what people really start doing with their vocals and extreme and screaming, and I mean, it really goes crazy. And I love all of that, but I'm also a lot like what you say because I'm 40, so I grew up with, things that were not like that, where we didn't have. One thing that bothers me about modern music a little bit about vocals is like the constant tuning. Um, and I feel as though kids are actually, their hearing is changing. When they hear all this like auto-tuned vocals, they don't actually hear like what an organic expression, like again, punk rock or classic rock, or even like just Kurt Cobain playing the acoustic, singing out of tune but singing expressively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's a real issue. And it's not a fight that's easy to have like in a studio with especially if you wind up working with younger musicians.
Oh yeah.
The whole way of approaching tracking vocals in the digital age is something that's also kind of made things very different and difficult in a way. I don't think you have to be as prepared when you go in. Um, uh, and not only that, but you also, or at least I feel like a kind of lack of control. Like I would always know, okay, well, we're going to do another track. He's opening a track that involves some work to get this, to make this space on this tape. And we're going to do 4 or 5 takes of this. Not go all the way through it and take a pass, go all the way through it and take a pass, like, I mean, and then they sit there and edit the stuff together. It's like, that to me feels wrong at some level.
It's very different.
Yeah. I mean, but I don't think it's wrong. I mean, I think it works out and it's really cool. But it's weird because I find myself much more than when I did all these records on tape. I find myself adapting my performance to these recordings of me singing, right? Like, instead of the other way around. It's pretty interesting.
Do you do any recording at home, or do you always do it with someone?
I do lots of recording at home. And it's the stuff I'm talking about, the difficulty I'm talking about is like in the studio, like working with a producer. Here at the house, I mean, in some ways, I don't know. I mean, I only do things a few times to get just to get ideas down, and I don't worry too much about how it sounds. I figure we pay people to do that.
Is so well. It's so fascinating talking to you, and I could talk to you for for another hour, but I hate to make vocalists sit there and talk that long. I mean, realistically, you guys are doing most of the talking, not me as much. But I wanted to kind of put a little end on here and say, what. So the focus seems like this year for GWAR. You're going to be doing lots of live. Is there any studio focus? Anything else we can hope to see from GWAR this year? Or is it really just road dogging it?
Yeah, we're road dogging and we're writing.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been doing a lot of writing here at the house. And I was actually noticing your desktop and I was like, man, I wish I didn't have Ventura on this goddamn computer.
Hey man, Mac attack all day.
Yeah, I know, but you've got the good operating system. It looks like.
Yep. But that's the thing is, I had to buy a new Mac though for that. There's a limit. My old laptop, but yeah, I can't even upgrade the OS anymore. So
no, I can't either. And then I had to buy this new one, and I don't know, like it's just very sort of not. It's got Ventura on it, and it's nice, but it's a little bit unstable right now for me.
What DAW do you use to record?
I use Logic.
Mm-hmm. Okay. At least you're using Apple's thing, so that should be better.
Mm-hmm. I know. Well, Logic itself is fine. It's the stuff that that I'm putting in it.
Thank you so much, Mike, for being on the podcast. You're a fascinating guy. Everybody look up his TedX talk that he did. It's really cool on YouTube. And go out and see GWAR this year. I just did not too long ago, and it was absolutely a blast. Where can people, is it just like GWAR.com? Where should they follow you guys?
Yeah, GWAR.net is our site.
.net.
Yeah, and so that's where you can go to find out what we're doing and stuff. And there's a lot of stuff that's come out this year, like in the past year, and there is more coming out this year. Not new music, but lots of other stuff. And we're working on a film. We're doing a lot of stuff. So it's a big production year for us, as well as traveling and touring.
That's so great. Well, I'm looking forward to it all. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to us on the podcast today. You're a fascinating dude, and I hope that we get to talk to you again sometime. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. That wraps up this episode of the Voicehacks Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the show.